Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Malta Business Network's first webinar meeting. I trust you're all actually well and keeping safe despite the coronavirus pandemic and the problem that's created all over the world. As a result of which, the Malta Business Network has not been able to hold its monthly meetings since February. And was really through the initiative of David Walsh, who's a chairman of the Malta Business Network in the UK, that started this initiative really to try and actually organize this MBN webinar. And it is our intention to try and actually organize this event every 2 weeks. So the next event will be held on the 9th of June at 5 o'clock. And the subject is going to be the gaming industry and post-COVID-19. And Kevin Valencia will be the moderator. And the guest speakers are Heathcliff Farrugia, who is the CEO to the Malta Gaming Authority. And there is Enrico Bradamonte, who's the chairman of IGEN, which is the largest actually gaming company in Malta. On the 23rd of June, we're thinking of organizing the third event. And the discussion that we're thinking of having is the opportunities of the Commonwealth in the context of Brexit. Obviously, there are quite a lot of people that I do need to thank. So there is the committee that's organizing this event, and I'd like to again take this opportunity of thanking David but in particular Peter Grech and his team who are behind the scene in organizing today's event. I'd also like to thank actually members of the two chapters, the board of directors of both the UK and Malta, who have actually supported this initiative. And we did actually have a couple of meetings to get this thing going. And we have actually set up a joint committee really to monitor the processes of these webinars. Without further ado, I'd like to actually, as I say, introduce David Walsh, who's going to act as the moderator. David is chairman of the MBN UK. A guest speaker who David will introduce is Professor Tim Evans, who is a great friend really of the MBN, particularly in the UK, because he's been our guest speaker on 2 or 3 occasions speaking about Brexit. So can I actually pass on the floor to David? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Joseph. And may I add my welcome to that of Joseph's and the board of directors. So thank you for joining. We're really delighted that for this inaugural webinar, we have as our guest speaker, Professor Tim Evans. He's professor at the Middlesex University and a political economist. Some of you might have heard Tim speak before at a UK MBN event on Brexit. How we miss those happy days about Brexit, okay? Seems a long time ago, and now we've been taken over by all the problems with COVID-19. Anyway, those who did hear Tim speak will know that you're in for a real treat this afternoon. As you can see from Tim's bio, Tim is considered to be one of the UK's top economic and financial thinkers, and he's got a wealth of government and academic experience. What you don't probably know is that Tim's dad was actually in the British Army and spent his national service in Malta in the early 1950s. And Tim was telling me that Malta made such a favourable impression on him that he remembers his dad regaling him with stories about Malta and about its very rich history. So at least some connection there between the UK, Malta, and Tim. Before I hand over to Tim, just a couple of practical points. Tim's going to speak for about 30 minutes or so. And what we'd like you to do throughout is if you feel you want to make any comments, or if you've got any questions you'd like to have raised, please would you look at your tab at the bottom. You'll see a Q&A tab, so you can actually click on that and you can type in your questions there. Once Tim has gone through his presentation, I'll be reviewing those questions, trying to sort of categorize them, and I'll be putting the questions for Tim's responses on those. Okay, so really looking forward to this. As you know, it's a bit of an experiment for the MBN to get these things up and running. This is our first one, and also be very interested in your feedback throughout. So Tim, over to you, and thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, and I hope everyone can hear me. I have to say I'm honoured and delighted, David and Joseph, to be your willing guinea pig on this new venture. It is absolutely a delight, and you're absolutely right, David, that my father was spent a year in Malta in the early 50s. I grew up with stories of the heroism of Malta, why it is Malta, George Cross, stories of faith, hope, charity, and all kinds of things that even now I'm not too sure of, like artillery sites or artillery guns being used on open site at Bahari Char. I don't know if I've said that correctly.
Yes, you did.
Okay, so I did. So I very much grew up with Malta in my heart. And my wife and I, my daughter, we love holidaying there, and we particularly enjoy going to Gozo. So it's a real honour and a delight for me to be speaking to you today. The title of my talk is Reflections on Global Britain in a Post-Wave 1 Coronavirus World. I should say to you, it's a confession, that I married my wife nearly 20 years ago, but we started dating in the mid-1990s. My wife has a PhD in health economics, but she's also a very experienced nurse, and she is by profession what is technically called a consultant infection and prevention and control nurse. So our hands at home have to be very clean, and hygiene is important. But on our second date, and I'm now going back probably into 1996, on our second date, as she looked into my eyes and I looked into her, and the romance started, she did say, she said, you know, Tim, we are overdue a pandemic. And the one thing you learn as life gets older is that, my goodness, time and again, women are always right. And she's done it again. We're in the middle of a pandemic. She told me 25 years ago it was overdue. But one of my reflections on all of this is how extraordinary, I think, difficult it would have been if we'd gone through all this without the internet. I think for many people, the internet, email came into their lives 1994 or 5. What if we had been trying to keep systems, the basics of economy and supply going in a pre-internet world? I think things would have been so much more difficult. My talk is divided into 3 sections. I'm going to talk a little bit about my reflections on this dreadful virus. I'm going to talk about the implications of it for the United Kingdom and geopolitically, the international arena. And then I want to talk about Britain and the future. So there was a time about a month ago when people started to say that, of course, Britain had one of the worst records with coronavirus in the world. And there are many problems I have with that as an academic. The first is that at no stage was the United Kingdom's NHS or health system overwhelmed by coronavirus. It does not give me any joy or any sense of nationalism to say that there are other countries that were. Italy was an example. You will all recall, I'm sure, that there was a time where the virus hit northern Italy so hard that they had to helicopter people not only to other regions, but to other countries. There were indeed northern Italian patients who were requiring ventilation in ICU. Some of them were sent all the way up to Germany. At no stage did the United Kingdom see A&E overwhelmed, or people who were receiving cancer or important treatments at the time. At no stage was that stopped. In fact, the United Kingdom seemed extremely effective, to my mind, at very quickly mobilizing its 220 independent hospitals, its military medical capacity, integrating it, which was done very, very swiftly, and also, particularly working alongside the military, building the Nightingale hospitals. Of course, the Nightingale Hospital in London was in effect an intensive care bed unit. Other Nightingales around the country were step-down units, thereby defending their local NHS and acute ICU units. So Britain did well in the sense that at no stage was it overwhelmed. And if there is any criticism of wave one, it is that we actually built to scale very quickly, probably too much capacity. But of course, at the time, who was to know that? If you were a planner, if you were in contingency planning, the Prime Minister, number 10, the Cabinet Office, wherever, you were being inundated. You were literally experiencing a roller coaster ride of information. And of course, you had all manner of problems. We know about testing. We have heard a lot about PPE. There were competing academics who were providing ministers and the Prime Minister with different models and scenarios. A lot of that has already bled out into the public domain. Very famously, Neil Ferguson at Imperial College on the SAGE committee seemed to have a very different view of the world and a very different view of modelling, for example, from his colleagues at Oxford University. So there were quite a few academics who weren't necessarily at war, but they were disagreeing. And there were also, I think, huge problems in the supply chain, and NHS supply chain limited, I think, was somewhat behind the curve when it came to logistics, and they had to be rescued, in particular by the military and specialist units like the Engineer and Logistics Staff Corps. But the roller coaster ride of information has been remarkable. And I want to remind everyone of the challenges that not just the Prime Minister and our leaders have faced, and not just in this country, but that we've all had to reconcile. We've all watched news reports, we've all opened newspapers, and we've all seen day by day, week in, week out, different reports about the impact of population density, the impact on BAME communities, or issues of obesity, or how and when the virus might be mutating, whether immunity will be short-term, as it is, for example, in norovirus, or will it be longer-lasting, as it is, for example, with chickenpox. We've all had to learn, I think, a fair bit about the difference. Again, we've had to remind ourselves of the difference between correlation and causation. We've had to think through the wormholes of causal factors and proportionality. And we've also had to watch different nations adopt different public policies and different approaches to stringency of lockdown. Some time ago, if you look at overall death rates as measured by excess deaths from what we would expect from this period, it was 3 or 4 weeks ago that at that point already the United Kingdom had experienced 45,000 excess deaths. I believe that's well over 50,000 today. And that compares to other episodes. So in 1957-58, we had the Asian flu. That took, sadly, 33,000 lives in the United Kingdom. And in 1968, with the so-called Hong Kong flu, there seems to be a lot of politics around how these things get labeled, by the way. But the so-called Hong Kong flu killed around 80,000 lives in in the United Kingdom. It was spread over several years. There was no lockdown, but then again, we weren't living in the world of millions to millions communication or social media. We were living in the old-fashioned world back then of broadcasting, when you effectively had the BBC, and if you were lucky, ITV. I think that in the middle of March, the British government did try to impose some kind of liberal, if I can call it Swedish-style lockdown, where they tried to keep last waves of the economy going. But if you remember, the politics of all of that simply overwhelmed the British government. Parents were clamoring to pull their children out of schools. Businesses were lobbying to be closed down temporarily. And if you will, everyone from the Guardian and the Telegraph and the Daily Mail had their way. The difference, of course, was that Sweden has a different cultural and political tradition. Sweden has a much more deferential media. It has a culture rooted in a much higher degree of collectivism. And Swedish culture really resolves around the idea of personal responsibility for the greater good. Whereas in the United Kingdom, our culture tends to resolve around English common law adversarial practice. That's why in our parliament, we don't have this consensual half circle where we're seeking consensus. No, we have politicians who endeavour to stand 2 sword widths or sword lengths apart. So I think the British government did early on want to adopt this more liberal lockdown approach, but they were overwhelmed. And then there are other complicating factors where, in fact, an awful lot of the international data means that you cannot as yet compare like for like. For example, how different countries record deaths and whether they're related to or caused by coronavirus varies wildly. And it will be a long time, I think, before we can have an accurate assessment of really what's happened. Of course, in terms of political economy and the traditional art of statecraft, any pandemic is not just about epidemiology and science. It's about culture. It's about politics. It's about economics. And the experience for politicians, I think, is they live, in a sense, and their advisors live in an absolute sea, a deluge of information, a world of don't knows, what ifs, and maybes. And quite frankly, they're damned if they do, and they're damned if they don't. I'm sure this is the same the world over, whether you're the Swedish government, there's been lots of criticism internally there. British government, we've seen this weekend, lots of criticism. I don't know of any country where lots of people on duty as senior politicians, ministers, or advisors or scientists haven't been damned. But of course, the pandemic is that moment uniquely when, in terms of political economy and statecraft, when really healthcare conjoins with the full coercive apparatus of the state. It's almost where your Ministry of Health teams up with your Ministry of Defence. And to expect governments to do well in this world, to run a pandemic on that information roller coaster ride. We'll all remember, I'm sure, the day when data came in seemed to indicating that people who were users of tobacco seemed to faring better than people who did not. Well, if you're the Minister of Health that day and you've got to answer questions on that, you really are living in a roller coaster. And to expect these people to operate, to somehow magic their way through perfect knowledge, perfect information, and make judgment calls that are always correct, is ludicrous. It would be rather like saying to Charles Rolls or Henry Royce or W.O. Bentley 100 years ago that your cars are rubbish because they don't travel at the speed of light. To expect this level of perfectionism is not actually consonant with the reality of the human condition. So one of my takeaways is that Britain has done well, but we don't know from the international data yet how well it's done. And I think we should all be kinder with each other, and particularly kinder with anyone of any political persuasion in any country who's found themselves on duty. Pandemics are medieval, dare I say it, by their nature, and the experience of politicians and advisors. They're damned if they do, they're damned if they don't. They are simply doing their best. So as we move away now from wave one in the United Kingdom, and it's been successful, as I say, insofar as at no stage was the NHS overwhelmed. If there is to be a wave two, then our health systems have been integrated across the NHS independent and the military sector. Those Nightingale units are built, they stand ready. They will be put into suspended animation or hibernation. But if a wave two does hit, then at least ministers and government here has bought the time to try and put in place testing, and they built the spare capacity and to try and work out the physical distance rules. So they bought some time, and hopefully they will put to rest the other issues of supply, like PPE and other devices and medications, which at times were found in short supply. So they've won some time, I think, for this summer. But one of the things I think that's also important, and I don't think this has fully hit the public yet, is that as the NHS comes out of all of this, blinking into daylight, having survived reasonably well wave one, it's actually coming out into that daylight, into that summer of ours, facing its largest ever challenge. And in some ways, numerically, a challenge that is even potentially bigger than coronavirus. You see, the NHS has had a blank checkbook recently. NHS trusts have had 13.4 billion of debt written off. But as we went into wave one, the NHS had not been performing that well. It had, back in April, around 4.4 million people on its waiting list. And the sad reality is, away from all the spin of politicians and various interest groups, the sad truth is that the NHS has not met its 18-week treatment to treatment standard for planned care since February 2016. The NHS had not met its A&E 4-hour standard since July 2015, and it has not met its 62-day cancer standard for more than 4 years. Today, as I speak to you, I say quite conservatively that the NHS probably has in excess now of 5.5 million people on its waiting list. And there are estimates, you would have seen some of them in the Times newspaper a couple of weeks ago, that suggest that by the autumn of this year, as we move into September, October, the waiting list will be in excess of 7 million people. So it faces a colossal challenge. And I think that that's not fully realized yet by mainstream public opinion. I don't think it's yet permeated popular consciousness. The NHS turned 70 in 2018. And at the time, the BBC, to celebrate that that milestone, the BBC commissioned a range of think tanks from around the world to actually look at the NHS's performance. And somewhat shockingly, some of the results they discovered was that in 8 major disease and health areas, the NHS is somewhat behind. And those areas are breast cancer, colorectal cancer, lung cancer, pancreatic cancer, lung disease, respiratory infections such as pneumonia, stroke, and heart attacks. And not only that, but really from the time of Tony Blair in the early noughties, the NHS has been fed oceans more money, to the point where, because the Conservatives are not historically trusted with the NHS. It's very difficult for a Tory government to persuade the British public, for whatever reason, that the NHS is safe in their hands. Well, it's for that reason that the NHS is having really, really substantial sums of money put its way. In fact, by the financial year 2023-4, the NHS is destined to represent 38%, nearly 40% of all UK government spending. It is by far the largest area or item of public expenditure in the United Kingdom. But as I say, it has lots of money, it's had its debt written off, but it is now facing a colossal and truly historic challenge, by far in terms of backlog, the largest challenge it has ever faced. One of the things that I think will have to come from this crisis as we start to think about the future, and I'm going to use examples initially just in healthcare, but I will go on to touch about to look at some other areas. One of the challenges we have, but it's an opportunity, is how can we learn from this crisis? Are there things that we've done differently in recent weeks that we can learn from and embed? And I'll give you just 3 examples, given in health the challenges that we face. The first is that 90% of all GP consultations since late March have actually been done like we're talking today. They've been done online, they've been done all through all this wonderful technology, or they've been done with the old-fashioned technology of the telephone. And whilst a percentage of people on those calls have indeed had to go on and have further diagnostics, maybe visit A&E or indeed visit a GP, in terms of triage and efficiency, this has been extremely successful. It turns out, who knew that the vast majority of people who needed to see their GP could actually be seen quite successfully and have all manner of solutions put their way. For example, including online prescriptions, without having to physically book an appointment, go along to a building, sit in a waiting room, meet the doctor, get all the way home, wait, et cetera, et cetera. No. And think of how capital intensive all those buildings are. So I think one of the challenges for the NHS is how can it learn from these online consultations, and how can we enhance triage? How can we see those people who really need to be seen, but for what turns out to be the overwhelming majority, how can they be seen online more efficiently and more effectively? Another example is clinical commissioning groups have been largely left out of the loop. And what's actually happened is NHS England have issued guidance directly to local NHS hospitals to team up directly and locally with their local independent hospitals. And I have to say, it's worked brilliantly. On the ground in local communities, people have got on and pulled all kinds of rabbits and miracles out of hat. That, I think, should carry on. We are very odd in this country in that we're the only country in Europe that doesn't fully mobilise its independent sector for the full advantage of its state-funded patients. And there seems to be an entire tier of bureaucracy in and around clinical commissioning groups, as they've been magically called, that have got in the way. The last thing I'll say is, now that those independent and those NHS hospitals are working well together, I think that that should continue. And we should learn from it, we should embed it, not least because independent hospitals are, to an extent, they're rather like, in economic terms, they're rather like airlines. They can often price at the margin, they can sell you the theatre time that isn't going to be used, often surprisingly cheaply, and so they could add significant capacity, but also value to local NHS hospitals. I think one of the opportunities, therefore, for the United Kingdom and other countries around the world is to capture these types of innovations, as I say, not just in healthcare, but in other sectors, and to turbocharge innovation and efficiency. I suppose if I have one of the great fear about the NHS, it is, and there's something in economics called Gammons, invented by Max Gammon, a British GP. And Gammon's law says that there is a reason you have a really big bureaucracy. Really big bureaucracy, could be state or private, doesn't matter, but a really big bureaucracy, and the NHS is a very large bureaucracy, that the danger is that if you pump more money into it and you don't incentivize these sorts of innovations, then it will act rather like a black hole. You can throw all kinds of planets and galaxies at a black hole, but you just feed it and you get less light emitted. Well, if you take the existing structure and you don't embed these reforms, then the danger is, as we all plow more money into it, you'll get less production emitted, less patients or it simply won't up. So I think we were successful in wave one. We will see later if we have wave two. We all, of course, have fingers crossed as to whether we will have a vaccine. A lot will rest on our university sector, I think, in the United Kingdom for that, because we are world beating in that area. But now more than ever, when it comes to efficiency and trying to get some upside for all this ghastliness, I think, to quote Tony Blair, what will matter is what will really work. Looking out to the world and going to part two, I have to say, and it's been quite surprising to me, I thought all of this would have been a huge opportunity for the European Union. I think I've had my breath taken away with how quickly countries have reverted to their own nation stateness, at how countries reverted to their own national contingency planning measures, to their own health systems, to their own cultures, and how it seemed to me, and I may be wrong, so I'm also here to learn if anyone has a comment, how almost Brussels and the former EU bureaucracy was not only behind the curve, but almost sleeping at the wheel. It seemed that solidarity fell apart very quickly, and that the EU was overwhelmed by a sense of this existential crisis, of where just de facto countries reverted to being nation states. And I think that one of the stories that has gone on in the EU and that almost has not been picked up here, there are a few people like Liam Halligan, Pritchard that have. But one of the things that I think is potentially very, very important for the future that happened during all of this wave one crisis was that a very significant German court ruled that the actions of the European Union vis-a-vis its own quantitative easing and its own debt measures around the 2008-9 crisis has been actually deemed illegal. And I don't know where that case is going to go. And I have no idea how it's going to bleed out into mainstream German politics in the months and years ahead. But it seems to me that given the history of Germany and its experience with hyperinflations in the early 20s and the collapse of the Reichsmark in 45, and the absolute cultural desire of Germans to adhere to this fiscal rectitude, this Northern European fiscal conservatism, that Germany is now on some sort of collision course with the ECB, various treaties, and the EU. And I think it was a German diplomat who was recently captured. I'm not sure this made much of a headline anywhere, but they sort of confessed in an interview when they didn't realize the microphone was on, that they are, and I quote, and it's a very odd quote, doomed to make the EU relationship with the French work. That did not fill me full of optimism, and it struck me as having very different political atmospherics, quite dark and pessimistic in comparison to a time when I was president of the Centre for New Europe in Brussels back in 2002-05. So moving on and looking out into the world and to the future, I do think that some countries will take this to be an opportunity for what I call zero-based policy. I think there are some countries that will want to learn, they want to capture innovation, and they will use this crisis as a reason, as a veneer, for introducing all manner of reforms for the future. I do not know. You hear all kinds of media reports, don't you, that the negotiations between, for example, the United Kingdom and Brussels are not going well. Apparently, they're supposed to go well by the end of June, or the talks could collapse. And you don't know if that's diplomatic brinksmanship or if the talks are in trouble. The British government is effectively run by a triumvirate. It's run by the Prime Minister, Dominic Cummings, and Michael Gove. They are, I think, pretty hardline Brexiteers, and given what has happened with the pandemic, and the pandemic has infinitely bigger economic ramifications, quite frankly, than Britain defaulting to WTO could have ever have had. But one does wonder if that triumvirate will actually conclude, if the negotiations with Brussels don't go well, that it may be opportune to default to WTO, blame the intransigence of Brussels, Barnier, and the economic problems around COVID to free Britain up as they may see it. I thought what might be useful for everyone in this call, in conclusion, as I speak for the final 2 or 3 minutes, and then I'll go quiet, is just to give you, if that were to happen, and I kind of take that as almost as a worst case scenario, if that were to happen, what actually are the cards that Number 10 or the United Kingdom holds as we go blinkingly towards 2021? We're out of the European Union. What if we default to WTO? And what if we're busying ourselves trying to come out of this economic crisis? Well, here are some cards that I think should be put together, if only for the sake of conversation. So we could enter next year remaining one of the world's great powers. The United Kingdom does still exert considerable economic, cultural, military, scientific, and political influence. It is not only normally a beacon of prosperity, but it is also a beacon of tolerance and fair play. And of course, you know that because partly it remains a primary target for those with malign intent, particularly in areas like information warfare. It's a country of 67 million people. It is the world's 6th largest economy by gross domestic product, and it's the 9th largest by purchasing power parity. The pound sterling is the world's oldest currency in continual use, and it's the 4th most traded reserve currency in the world. In terms of international relations and diplomacy, the United Kingdom would remain a member of the Commonwealth of Nations, the Council of Europe, the G7, the G20, NATO, the OECD, and of course the WTO. It's been a permanent member of the UN Security Council since its inception in 1946, and it remains a cornerstone of the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, comprising Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United States. We, with our partners there, not only have as our head of state the head of state of 4 of those 5 countries, but together these countries comprise the most comprehensive espionage alliance in history. And when it comes to education and talent, the UK is a high-income economy with a high human development rating, placing it well within the top 15 countries of the world. Its higher education system, its universities, have more than 10% of the world's top 100 universities. And in the first 10 years of this century, our universities accounted for some 7% of the world's scientific papers and 8% by scientific citations, with a third after the US and China, respectively. Across science and technology, we make a huge contribution. We gifted in the last century penicillin, and DNA, of course, was revealed by Francis Crick. Since the early 19th century, British inventions have included the steam locomotive, the electric motor, the commercial electric telegraph, the incandescent light bulb, the first practical telephone. In the 20th century, we led the first working television system, the jet engine, and the basis of the modern computer. And in this century, Sir Tim Berners-Lee quite recently was given the Turing Award for inventing the World Wide Web, the first web browser, and the fundamental protocols and algorithms allowing the web to scale. So the UK remains also a major military power. It's one of the world's top 5 military powers in terms of expenditure, and it has arguably some of the world's most professional and highly trained armed personnel tasked with protecting the UK and its overseas territories. It has armed forces that are also heavily engaged with promoting and defending global security interests and supporting international peacekeeping and humanitarian aid efforts. It's one of the world's only 5 recognized nuclear powers. And today, the UK has overseas garrisons and facilities in Ascension Island, Bahrain, Belize, Brunei, Canada, Cyprus, Diego Garcia, the Falkland Islands, Gibraltar, Germany, Kenya, Oman, Qatar, and Singapore. In the 21st century, the Royal Navy remains, particularly with its 2 new aircraft carriers, one of the world's foremost blue water navies. And of course, we're also ranked as one of the world's leading soft power superpowers. And in fact, in 2016, we were ranked as number 1. Through the country's language, cinema, theatre, arts, television, sports, architecture, music, Britain and the UK is loved in many ways the world over. British culture is rich and diverse tapestry, and I think it powerfully brings together innovation, diversity, and the modern with the traditional. However, such soft power presents more than simply culture. It denotes an ability to shape the preferences of others through appeal and attraction, rather than the traditional 19th century methods of coercion. So, in conclusion, the United Kingdom, I think, faces huge challenges, not least in terms of healthcare, that people don't fully understand yet. There's a huge backlog of people here. There are lots of opportunities here in healthcare and every other sector and other nation to learn from this and to embed new ways of working and efficiencies. And we may do that, or very sadly, we may revert to being creatures of habit. Will there be successful negotiations post-Wave 1 with the EU, particularly in June? I don't know. Or will the UK default to WTO? Whatever we do, we're in for a very economically rocky ride now. But I do think, and this is absolutely my final point, that if you're running an autocratic regime, if you're in Tehran, if you're in Moscow, if you're in China, you have a problem in that this virus has meant you have had to become more autocratic, and you've had to lock down further and use technology and more oppressive. And we've seen from China, they haven't always been honest. And so they've hit an inflection point where I think they have made increasingly some difficult choices, some wrong choices, and choices that might make their systems less agile, less flexible, and more brittle. I contrast that with the United Kingdom that holds some powerful cards, and I've illustrated some, and that might be later this year really free to do all manner of deals that, to be honest with you, I would not have foreseen when I spoke to you last time. Will we do Five Eyes trade deal? Will we do a Commonwealth deal? What will we do bilaterally? I don't know, but I think this pandemic has changed so much. Thank you very much indeed.
Tim, thank you very much indeed for that very insightful pitch there. Thank you. It's really interesting. And in fact, we've got quite a lot of questions to try and get through in the next 15 minutes. I'll try and clump them together. I think there's some questions about the UK economy. I think there's some questions around its relationship with the EU,
yep,
and also some questions about its relationship with Asia and China in particular. So just to give you some context of the questions that have come in. So starting with the UK, given the fact that we've had to see extraordinary levels of funding and support from the government, as an economist, what's your opinion of how this will be unwound, and what kind of outcome could we see with the UK economy as this is becoming, if you like, become more regulated to become less regulated as we try to balance the books again? What's your opinion on that?
I think there were three choices, three scenarios. I'm much more a fan of scenarios and frameworks than I am of models. I'm quite critical of most economists who think that economics is some branch of purely mathematics and that therefore it's a science and gives you enormous predictive capability. No, I think actually properly conceived economics is a branch of the social sciences and therefore it's rooted in human action, and humans are unpredictable. Very few models can capture or would have captured at the Treasury or the Bank of England or any university back in January or back in the autumn of last year what has just happened. But there are three scenarios to consider, and then I'll put a spin on it. I think the first is, of course, you could see an absolute collapse of demand, people's savings, businesses going down. And if you can imagine a sort of L-shaped issue where simply the economy goes down and it flatlines. The other scenario is that things go down. They've gone down very rapidly, high unemployment, all the indices, looking at the Baltic index for shipping trade, price of oil, huge drop in everything, businesses collapsing, some people being furloughed, unemployment, all the rest of it. But that somehow in the fourth quarter of this year, and notice I'm doing a U-shaped curve here, that things start to pick up and we return to some sort of growth and that quickly we go back. The other scenario was, of course, somehow we had a very quick collapse with a very quick bounce back. So the word to keep in mind is love. LUV, those I think are the three scenarios. Look, any economist who can tell you that with certitude that they can predict this future is lying. So all I can do is give you a very human hunch. And the human hunch is it's probably going to be somewhere between a U and a V, but with a bit of a Nike, if I'm allowed to advertise on this channel, a bit of a Nike swoosh. That's my hunch. But we will see, and we will know quite quickly. I think you mentioned Southeast Asia and questions around that and the European Union. So I think the first thing I would say is there were lots of course, unexpected things that happened. And lots of people, I think, from a risk assessment, looking at their risk registers, will want to look at supply chain issues. I know that Japan, I think, are giving a multi-billion-dollar incentive to business, to their corporations, to move supply chains away from being so reliant on China in certain areas. I think lots of people in the UK will be mindful that China were not truthful. They were not open with us, with the World Health Organization early on, that we lost a lot of time because of that. And that they're not necessarily to be trusted. This is, of course, a totalitarian communist state, and that we have to think not only through the wormholes of our industrial, our defence industrial strategy, and we might want, not only do we want certain technologies for aircraft and tanks and all the rest of it, but to think through or add to that defense industrial strategy, add things like certain drugs, medications, PPE, whatever, might be a review. We're going to have to think through those supply chains. I think many companies and organizations will. And I'll give you one very salient example. As we all know, an awful lot of British banks had outsourced a lot of their front-end communications with customers to call centers in India. Well, when India went into lockdown, it meant that those call centers closed. And one of the reasons why British banks found it so difficult to process things like mortgages or simply conversations with their customers was because their supply chains and their risk registers hadn't factored those things in. So I think there's going to have to be a lot of thinking done. On the EU, I am surprised at, again, how badly I think Brussels has communicated. I mean, I think I said last time when I spoke to the MBN that I thought that Brussels had handled the Brexit vote badly in Britain. This idea that they were going to make Britain pay and it was going to be very tough negotiations. I thought it was too strident. It came across as undiplomatic and not sufficiently friendly. I think that the communications, particularly coming from Barnier, regarding the United Kingdom, but I have to say, some of the political atmospherics facing other member states have not been as warm or fluffy or diplomatic as I would have expected. So I think Brussels really has to up its game in its communications. But I am increasingly persuaded that they are facing some kind of existential crisis. And I don't know the degree of panic that's going on. There could well be some kind of breaking up, potentially, plausibly, of the euro in the next few years if the Germans and the German electorate become increasingly doubtful about the euro, and there could be some sort of schism between the northern Europeans and the southern in a way that I think was difficult to imagine a year or two ago.
Mm. Tim, thank you for that. You've touched on all those points. If I could just go a bit deeper on the EU side, there's quite a few questions that are kind of connected together on that, and it's entirely around this issue to do with whether Europe is having a kind of good COVID or a bad COVID experience, and the fact that you mentioned already that it's certainly not in Europe so much, but there has to be more of a national interest in terms of a national response to what's happened as a population and its health service and support around that. Do you see that the EU, well, I think you probably answered this question, but has the EU been strengthened by this experience, or will it be strengthened? Will people realise it's better to be together than apart? Or do you feel that it actually has weakened Europe, the COVID situation? And given that, do you feel that our role in that would have been any different had we not already decided to leave the EU?
So my gut reaction, and it's not, it's more heart, it's an impression I get. My impression is that, yes, it's less head, it's more emotional. My impression is that Europe have not covered themselves in glory, but it's a very, very difficult brief. And it's a difficult brief because there are so many different cultural and constitutional arrangements. It strikes me that one of the strengths, for example, of Germany has been its decentralization. It has had a more decentralized healthcare system than certainly we do in the United Kingdom. You have the power of the Länder, and also they have a lot more industrial capacity. And culturally, they're different. I mentioned earlier how Swedish culture, which is this peculiar approach to a deep sense of personal responsibility, very individualistic, but for the greater good. And that has enabled the Swedish government to tell the public to act responsibly, not to panic. For example, I think in Sweden, I'm right in saying that sixth form colleges and universities were closed whilst primary and secondary schools carried on. Basically, the public and the media did what the authorities were asking. Well, of course, in Britain, this very adversarial and very, very individualistic culture, whatever the government were arguing early on, the British public were very sceptical. The opposition were very sceptical, and so in Sweden, the economic, response was that most restaurants remained open. It's Swedish people again tend to work more from home. There's a lot more digital capability there than, for example, there is in the United Kingdom. But it became apparent just how different these countries are, and I could talk for hours about, for example, how different Slovakia is from the Czech Republic, and you would tell me about how Malta has done things differently from other allies in and around the Mediterranean. I think it was very, very difficult for Brussels to cope with countries that were defaulting almost overnight to putting up borders, barriers, and defaulting to the intrinsic culture and values that the country had. And so they were faced suddenly with a pandemic that accentuated difference and borders and And then overlaying all that was the hyper competition, where states were doing whatever they could to access ventilators, drugs, PPE. And that became, I think, a real fist fight and very, very sharp elbows. And Brussels never quite found the rhetoric, the story for itself or its role. It talked about solidarity, but nobody was listening. Everybody was trying to get the PPE, the ventilators, and do what was right for their own country.
Tim, it's been a very fascinating insight to the issues, as you mentioned, around COVID and our relationship with Europe and the wider world. There's been quite a lot of discussion around the opinions of epidemiologists versus the opinions of economists, okay? And I just wonder, from an economist point of view, what's your view of, from an economist point of view, of how the UK has handled this, and not just in the UK, but its wider relationship with its trading partners?
I do not envy. My biggest response to that is I do not envy anybody who is in Britain or in any other country, the head of the Prime Minister's policy unit or the chief scientist or in the epidemiologist committee or the chief medical officer or the Prime Minister. This is an unenviable task, and as I said earlier, you're damned if you do something and you're damned if you don't. What I can confess are my concerns, and I have an ocean of don't knows, and we're not going to know the real cost in economic terms of any of this, I think, well into next year or even the following year. So here are some of my worries. We've lost a lot of life. There are a lot of people. There've been people lost at my university. We've lost student nurses on the front line. My brother-in-law has lost one of his best friends, who is a wonderful cricketer, a 43-year-old chap. He had no other comorbidities, no other medical conditions, but COVID-19 got him. So a lot of people have died. A lot of people continue to die every day. I also worry at how many people didn't turn up to A&E, at how many people have not sought the right cancer treatment or put off because they didn't want to be a nuisance or go to their local NHS hospital. They put off maybe their heart treatment or a lump and a bump that they've come across. We know from the economic downturn, the woes of 2008-9, that somewhere in the region of 10,000 people, we believe, committed suicide linked to that economic downturn. We don't know yet what the cost of this crisis is going to be in terms of mental health, in terms of suicides. We don't yet know. I read recently in one of the national newspapers that there could be 5,000 or 6,000 additional deaths for people who haven't got their cancer treatment in a timely fashion. And that's not that the system wasn't necessarily there for them. It's that they didn't want to overwhelm or add to the woes of the healthcare system. I really don't think it's going to be till 2021, 2022, where we're going to see the long tail effects of this crisis in terms of human life, in terms of health, or in terms of the economy. I think this has a long time to run. I think we'll only start to be able to look back in 2022, 23 and say, wow, this is what actions were done. This is what governments did the world over. This is what we did in Britain. But we didn't know that we were triggering all manner of unintended consequences that we didn't realize at the end. I mean, it's a very basic truth in economics or in any social science. Nobody is an all-seeing bureaucratic God. Nobody can predict the future. However many models and mathematical variables or equations people scribble, humans are unpredictable. And their unintended consequences, their unpredictability, is often unmodelable. There will be things that none of us on this webinar today will have thought of, but will become apparent over the weeks and months ahead. So we've got a lot of learning. We have a lot of looking back to do. my only hope, and it is a hope, that the lives that are lost are not lost in vain, that we are not just creatures of habit and go back to the old ways and the old efficiencies, that we try and learn and embed better ways of working moving forward. And that's where I hope something good may yet come from this wicked disease.
Yes, Tim, and I thank you for those sentiments, and I'm with you. I think although things have been absolutely awful, and you said a terrible loss of life and stress and so on, I think there are some positives coming out of the situation, which hopefully will sustain us in the months and years ahead. So thank you for that.
Pleasure.
We've got some great questions. Tim, I don't know whether this is possible, but I might just drop you a line perhaps with some of the specific things that have come up. Would that be okay if I did that? Because given this is our first event, we've just been learning about the interaction. In fact, I would say we've got a fantastic amount of interaction. We've got some great feedback, and to do proper service of the questions that we're going to answer and perhaps get some more opinions from you, I could then publish it to the attendees. That would be helpful. Thank you.
Pleasure.
But on behalf of the Malta Business Network, Tim, thank you so much for for giving us this very insightful discussion. It's always great to hear you talk and get your perspective, and you always come away sort of learning things and getting a new slant of things. So, Tim, on behalf of all of us, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And so everyone who's joined us, we've had a good attendance. Thank you for joining. As Joe said, we've got a series coming up. The next one is in a couple of weeks, which is on iGaming, which we've got a couple of great speakers on that. And we've got one, I think, planned 2 weeks.
On the 23rd of June.
On the 23rd of June, yeah.
Which will be
Joe,
about
do you want to add anything at all? Joe, do you want to add anything at all?
Sorry, no, that's fine. I'd just like to actually thank all the participants really for joining us this evening.
Yeah.
Thank
you, everyone.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone.
See you in person soon. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.